This is Inside the Americas, coming up in today's show. As Joe Biden now officially transitions toward the White House, we'll take a look at the staff making up what's set to be the most diverse presidential cabinet in U.S. history. Then racism isn't just a problem in the U.S. A protest movement is growing in Brazil after the murder of a black man at a Carrefour supermarket by two white security guards. And it's Thanksgiving in the United States. Coming up, the effect COVID is or isn't having on the busiest travel period of the year. I'm Jeannie Godula. Joe Biden's official transition to the presidency got underway this week with the federal government finally approving funds for a smooth transfer of power. The president-elect already lining up his cabinet, what he hopes will be the most diverse one in U.S. history. Solange Moujon takes a look.
Getting to work with a trusted team. Joe Biden says he's selected experienced, crisis-tested leaders for his cabinet, and he's also broken some historic barriers in the process. The president-elect pegged Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary. If confirmed by the Senate, she'll be the first woman to lead it in its 231-year history. A renowned labor economist, she said Americans need extraordinary fiscal help because of the coronavirus. Another first, Alejandro Mayorkas, as head of the Department of Homeland Security. The first Latino to hold the position, his nomination signals a desire to regain trust in communities that have become deeply distrustful under Trump's immigration policies. Perhaps the most well-known pick, John Kerry as U.S. climate envoy. The role didn't exist before, but it signals a desire to put climate change on the top of Biden's agenda. Kerry negotiated and signed the Paris Climate Accord for the U.S. before Trump withdrew from the pact. The vice president-elect has also named Avril Haines to become Director of National Intelligence. If confirmed, she'll be the highest-ranking woman intelligence officer ever. Then there's Linda Thomas Greenfield as ambassador to the UN. The African-American diplomat will, as ambassador, be given a seat back on the National Security Council. Spearheading the U.S.'s foreign policy, Anthony Blinken has been pegged as Secretary of State. Most of the nominations must still get the green light from a very divided Senate. But Biden's choices have already made a break with the previous administrations. Not just in regard to race and gender barriers, but they signal a return to favoring international alliances and government aid for struggling Americans.
This week, Americans are celebrating one of their favorite holidays, Thanksgiving. And it was a bit of a lame duck president who hosted the annual White House turkey pardon, sparing a farm bird from the Thanksgiving table and maybe previewing pardons for some of his human friends. Americans eat some 45 million turkeys every Thanksgiving, and the bizarre presidential ritual of pardoning one lucky bird dates back decades. It was made even stranger this year, though, in the midst of Trump's unprecedented refusal to concede defeat to Joe Biden. Now, Thanksgiving is also traditionally the busiest travel period of the year. Last year, 26 million Americans traveled through U.S. airports over the long holiday weekend. And while the number of airline passengers has significantly dropped this year due to the ever-increasing pandemic in the U.S., many Americans are just plain ignoring expert advice to stay home. Claire Rush explains.
If not for the face masks, one could almost believe these scenes were from the pre-coronavirus era. Airports packed with travelers preparing to crisscross the country for Thanksgiving. While the number of people flying is down by half compared to last year, the weekend before this year's holiday marked the busiest travel days since the beginning of the pandemic in March, with 3 million passengers going through airport security gates. Crowds are only expected to grow, with many unwilling to miss out on seeing family, despite health experts' pleas urging people to stay home.
I think we can't just stop living. So I think it's really important that everyone just takes the precautions. And I feel like the airlines are really being safe. I feel like it's safer to go on a flight than it is to go to the supermarket these days.
Before meeting up with loved ones, many are flocking to testing sites. But not everyone is taking the risk to see family. Some have even canceled their flights.
We were going to go on a trip and we had to cancel. We bought extra seats in the rows and everything to help protect us, but we still thought it was too risky.
As lines grow at testing sites, they're growing at food banks as well. This year, millions are depending on these distributions for their holiday meals and the traditional Thanksgiving turkey.
Happy Thanksgiving.
According to the nonprofit Feeding America, 1 in 6 Americans is experiencing food insecurity, a 50% increase from last year. A worrying trend that may worsen further as the U.S. faces one of its worst coronavirus surges yet. The country is averaging 1 million new cases a week as public health conditions worsen in nearly all 50 states, prompting the nation's top epidemiologist to take to the media with a direct warning for travelers.
They're putting themselves and their family members at risk. And what we see is that we're in a difficult situation that we shouldn't throw up our hands in despair, because we really can do something about it if we adhere to these measures that are public health measures that we talk about.
State and local governments have reimposed a host of restrictions in recent weeks to curb the spread, as hospitals in several states near breaking point amid the current surge. COVID-19 has killed nearly 260,000 Americans, with over 12 million testing positive since the pandemic began.
The COVID situation is a better one in Argentina, where the numbers are starting to decline. The country is slowly opening up again after almost 8 months of confinement. And while schools may be opening in Buenos Aires, most other schools around the country are still closed. That means many students in Argentina have been out for almost an entire school year.
After 8 months, the schools of Buenos Aires, which had been closed since March 15th, are beginning to open again. Today, a few first-grade students have returned to school. Protocols are very strict. Temperature is taken and hydroalcoholic gel is sprayed. And lots of space is given to these very small groups of children, which will rotate twice a week with other groups for 2-hour periods. Today, Giannina is feeling there is less than 1 month left before the end of the school year.
They spent almost all of their first year virtually, so now the priority is to reconnect with them through play and to see what they actually learned during those long months.
The whole country is open again, but outside of the city of Buenos Aires, almost all of the schools remain closed. So a few parents organize themselves in order to protest, like in this upscale district north of the city. Parents are exhausted and cannot manage both their jobs and helping with schoolwork anymore. But mostly, it's their children's isolation that worries them, weakening bonds with their classmates.
It's been my saddest year. I spent most of the confinement crying. I spent my days in bed, watching the wall, without being able to do my homework, to talk to my friends. I feel so alone. I want to go back to school.
They hope that the image of their protest, posted on social media, will go viral and put pressure on the government. A few miles away in this poor neighborhood, schools now play another social role. There are no in-person classes here either, but there's regular distribution of food and hygiene products. Material conditions of life here make virtual learning very difficult.
My daughter is really behind on homework. Because the family computer is so old, we have almost no internet and her cell phone is broken. When I can, I lend her my own, but I need it for work. So many times she cannot study.
Despite the work and dedication of the teachers, who sometimes pay internet cards themselves for their most destitute students, almost 1.5 million have stopped showing up online for school during the pandemic.
Brazil was rocked this week by protests reminiscent of the Black Lives Matter movement in the U.S. The turning point, the brutal death of a 40-year-old black man held down and beaten by 2 white security guards. A video of the killing went viral, prompting not just protests, but a boycott of the French supermarket chain Carrefour, where the violence took place. Here's a report from our correspondents on the ground.
Every day since the death of João Alberto, the same scene has been repeated in front of Carrefour stores all over Brazil. Like George Floyd in the United States, he too was suffocated by security guards at a Carrefour supermarket. The protesters' slogan echoes the one chanted in the demonstrations in the United States. These Brazilians are determined that their mobilization will have an impact.
We want accountability not only for the people directly involved, but also for the directors of Carrefour Brazil. We are here on the streets and we will not move until the final consequence, which is the departure of the CEO of Carrefour Brazil.
The French company already has a long history of violence and racist behaviour by its security agents in Brazil. Very embarrassed, Carrefour broadcast this message on the national news.
The extent of this tragedy is beyond me as a privileged white man that I am. First of all, I offer my condolences to the family of João Alberto.
By a sad irony of the calendar, the day after the death of João Alberto, Brazil commemorated the National Day of Black Consciousness, a date ignored by the governments of Jair Bolsonaro, which denies the existence of structural racism in the country.
There's no racism in Brazil, it's something they want to import, but it doesn't exist here.
As a man and president, I see everyone the same color, green and yellow.
The protesters don't see it like that. In Rio, what happened to João Alberto has an echo in hundreds of cases of police violence. 80% of the victims are black. Young people from poor neighbourhoods, like Pablo, fear the police.
If we take into account this year, 2020, there have been a lot of aberrant cases concerning the black population here in Brazil and in Rio de Janeiro, in particular because of the favelas where police violence is increasing a lot.
But in a country where more than half of the population are black or mixed race, well, those protesting wish the mobilisation could be as strong as in the United States.
And finally, just when you thought 2020 couldn't get any weirder, it somehow has. A giant metal monolith has mysteriously appeared in the middle of a desert in Utah. The tower you can see there is almost as tall as 2 men. It was spotted by a helicopter crew that was looking for bighorn sheep. The origin of the bolted-together structure is still unknown. Officials are keeping its remote location under wraps over fears people will try to go and see it and become stranded. We'll leave you with that. Thanks so much for watching this Inside the Americas. We'll see you again next time for all the news from north to south.
With all the main European news, debates between representatives of the best and worst performing EU member states, and exclusive interviews with major personalities.
Talking Europe, presented by Catherine Nicholson on France 24 and France24.com.